Hey everybody, you guys aren't going to believe what happened to me, but they got me. I've been captured. So, I want to just say happy Halloween, everyone. Doing a little Halloween special. I'm a prisoner. I'm in, getting my pictures taken soon, but they're letting me talk to you guys real quick first. So, wanted to do a Halloween stream, so happy Halloween. Appreciate you guys coming out to join me on today. This for a Halloween little stream. We're going to be talking about the problem of evil, which has been a big topic in my life lately. Been definitely coming up a lot. But before that, I just wanted to say that, I know that there's a lot of people out there that do not like Halloween and don't like celebrating it. My family and I like to, some of us, especially my girls, like to dress up in costumes and stuff like that. So I like to have fun with it in that regard. We're not huge on Halloween, but we do like to do costumes and go to trick or trunk or things like that, trick or treating as well on the holiday. Go to churches and stuff. My little boo, we went to her school to do a trunk or treat, and everyone loved her. They thought that she looked so cute. She went as a fairy, and we had a lot of fun there. Everyone thought she was so super cute, like I said, and they kept asking me, when did you get out? And I was like, just a couple hours ago. I escaped. So we're gonna be doing a little Halloween live stream, and I hope that you guys like it and you play along with me in this time. But looks like they're coming to take pictures. So all right, just a second. I gotta stand up straight for this. The straight on face and the side profile. There, I hope is that good? Yeah, for Christian proselytizing, yeah, they took me. Hopefully this never really becomes a thing where you can get in prison for it in the United States, but you never know. But what's that? All right, I guess it's time to go to the cell. So, I'm in jail, everyone. But yeah. Screenshotted. Yeah. But I hope that you guys don't mind doing this book study with a prisoner. Today we're doing the problem of evil, and I've done a lot of evil in my life, and I'm sure that you guys can relate on that matter. But it's interesting that as far as like arguments for the existence of God and against the existence of God, the problem of evil is definitely the one that is most Halloween themed, and just to say that's coming up a lot in my life, I just recently posted a video with Zach Stevens from Groton Bible Chapel, The Problem of Evil, where we talk about what the problem of evil is and some three good ways to reply to the problem of evil. And you can find that video on Facebook and on YouTube and things like that. I highly recommend checking it out. Paul was a prisoner, but he's all right. Yeah. Yep. So it's not un-Christian to be in jail, But just with regard to On Guard, which as a reminder, as always, I like to do this at the beginning of the stream, is remind you guys where you can find the book. You can find On Guard on christianbooks.com as well as Amazon. I highly recommend you guys get the book, so that you can reference it or follow along in the reading and everything like that. I think that it's a very valuable resource. There's many times in which I still look back at On Guard just to verify how the arguments are portrayed by Dr. Craig and how he goes about formulating things. Very good book to have. But basically, today, we are going to be talking about the problem of evil as Dr. Craig places it in his book, and he gives us three kind of ways to go about it. The first one is that he separates the problem of evil into two main categories, and then there's some subcategories to one of them. The first categories are the emotional problem of evil and the intellectual problem of evil. The emotional problem of evil deals with somebody reacting negatively to evil and just rejecting God because of how distasteful evil is. And then the other one is the intellectual version, in which you think about it philosophically and not as emotionally. And what's emphasized in the book is that you do not want to approach the problem of evil from you don't want to respond to the emotional version of the problem of evil intellectually, and you don't want to respond to the intellectual problem of evil emotionally. And so we'll be going over that in this chapter, as well as in this chapter is also there's some subcategories under the intellectual problem, which we're going to be going into, and it's going to be the logical version of the problem of evil and the evidential version of the problem of evil. So I hope that you guys are ready to dive into it. I am a big fan of how Dr. Craig goes about presenting the problem of evil and rebutting it. In that video I mentioned earlier with Zach, I talk about my favorite version to combat the problem of evil, and I don't know if you'll see it while I'm in jail, but this book, Evil, God and the Problem of Evil, 5 Views. This book is a great introduction to the discussion, the various ways of how theists can go about rebutting the problem of evil. Great introduction, but there's a lot of discussion on this topic, and so I hope that you're ready to get introduced to it. So, without further ado, and if there's no questions or anything like that, then we'll start jumping into the book. And I hope that you guys like my Halloween-themed skin. I'm getting a little bit nommed here, but that's all right. Just move myself over a little bit there. But yeah. So we can jump into it. All right, so Dr. Craig prefaces the book with the chapter. Thanks, Stu. Appreciate it. So Dr. Craig prefaces the book with Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 4. We always rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. So in the previous 4 chapters, we've seen 4 powerful arguments for the existence of God based on philosophical... just a second. All right, so in the previous 4 chapters, we've seen powerful arguments for the existence of God based on philosophical, scientific, and moral considerations. Together, they make up a strong case for belief in God. But, of course, we need to consider the evidence on the other side of the scale, too. Can the unbeliever offer equally powerful arguments to show that God does not exist? So, there's no evidence that God exists, so... As a matter of fact, there really aren't very many arguments against God's existence. The atheist's main complaint is that there isn't any evidence for God's existence. But if you've mastered the 4 arguments we've just run through, that complaint won't apply to you. Non-believers aren't used to running into Christians who can actually give reasons for the hope that is in them. When the unbeliever says there's no evidence that God exists, you can stop him dead in his tracks by saying, gosh, I can think of at least 4 good arguments that show that God exists. At that point, he's got to say, like what? And you're off and running. You'll find non-believers are often so ill-equipped to discuss these issues that all they can do is respond to the arguments is just repeat themselves. That's no evidence that God exists. One blogger characterized my debate with British atheist Lewis Wolpert in Central Hall, Westminster, London, in this way. Wolpert, there's no evidence for God's existence. Craig, there is evidence for God's existence, and here it is. Wolpert, there's no evidence for God's existence. Craig, there is evidence for God's existence, and here it is. Wolpert, there's no evidence for God's existence. All right, so we're up to the first talk about it. Do you think it's ever helpful to engage with statements like, I think religion is all just in your head, or religion has done more harm to society than anything else? If so, under what circumstances and how? If not, why not? So I personally do engage in these kinds of topics a lot, especially online, but also in person. Not so much, I think religion is all just in your head. I kind of just ignore those things, but I do engage a lot with religion has done more harm to society than anything else. I like to provide them with quotes from historians talking about how Christianity in various ways has produced moral improvement in societies, especially barbaric societies, and also how even somebody like Charles Darwin has witnessed himself the benefits of Christian missionary work as he traveled the high seas and has actually endorsed it. But yeah, oftentimes you gotta judge not only the person that you're talking about or talking to, but also the audience. Sometimes it's if the person doesn't seem like they are willing to engage honestly with the conversation, it's best just to leave it alone and just to live your Christian life and to keep moving. But if there's an audience, then it might be a good idea to engage respectfully and with respect, because then you can provide a defense that the other people can consider, even if they don't participate in the conversation. Du says a religion took us out of the dark ages, so yep, I agree with that. You know, the thing is that you have to have the right kind of religion. You know, you have to have the right kind of religion that provides a framework that helps you understand or recognize that the world has regularity and laws. So, like on Christian theism, things like science make a lot of sense. You also need a religion in which human rights or general human flourishing is maybe not endorsed, but a side effect of following the religion, in which Christianity is one of those things. And Du says that even just encouraging the poor to read help to better their lives. Yeah. So literacy definitely helps to increase awareness and learning, and learning also helps to increase moral. It also helps to produce moral improvement. You know, there's some cultures out there that have bookstores outside, and you see this actually here too, like in Books A Million, where I'm at. They'll just leave books outside and stuff, and the idea is that a reader doesn't steal and a thief doesn't read. So you can get away with leaving books outside because, and same thing with like, we have a book barn out here in which all the books are outside and there's like little to no security, and they just trust you to come up to their desk and pay for it. And they seem to be doing very well. So, but yeah, there's a lot to it. There's a lot that goes into this. A very complicated topic, how religion has helped society and how it's harmed society. Very complicated topic. But sadly, this so Dr. Craig continues, sadly, this characterization is not far from the truth. Sometimes it seems as if non-believers are deaf. They've been taught to repeat there's no evidence for God's existence like a mantra, apparently believing that saying it again and again somehow makes it true. It's really a cover for intellectual laziness and a lack of engagement. It's just a way of saying, I'm not convinced by your arguments. So if the unbeliever responds to your arguments by saying there's no evidence that God exists, just say politely, well, I guess you don't find my arguments convincing. So you must think some of my premises are false. Which premise do you reject and why? One atheist I was talking with exclaimed, that at that point I reject all of them, to which I replied, surely you don't reject all of them. Do you reject that the universe exists, or that the fine-tuning of the universe is due to physical necessity, chance, or design? He recognized that his remark had been careless. Try to get the believer to engage with your specific premises. All right, so talk about it. We're up to the second one already. What are some of the emotional reasons why people might reject God and have no interest in logical arguments? So, just as a reminder, I'm providing these my initial answer, and feel free to comment your answers as well as I give mine initially, and we can discuss it further. But I see this kind of stuff a lot, and I think that I want to highlight that it's really important when Dr. Craig says that you need to talk about specific premises. When you zero in on specific premises, it really helps to focus the conversation, but that also means that you really need to understand the premises of the arguments and also why they should be preferred over their negation. Okay, so James says in response to the talk about it, personal experience and hurt in one's own life. Yep. So that was what I was going to say, especially the hurt that's provided by fathers in particular seems to be a really tough thing for people to deal with when they're trying to develop their relationship with God and understand Him as a heavenly Father. If their earthly father has been poor in his behavior, then it can be a huge hurdle for people to overcome. Dew says, believe in God means that they have to account for their actions in this life. Right. And I think that's why atheists, there are many atheists out there that see arguments for the existence of God and are bent on disproving all of them. I recently read, I was reading and studying this book called Unreasonable Faith, and it just seemed... It was written by somebody named James Fodor, and it just seems like he literally cannot bring himself to agree with Dr. Craig on anything. Now, I can understand disagreeing with Dr. Craig on a lot of points because I disagree with Dr. Craig on a lot of points, but it just struck me as dogmatic, like he was just bent on disagreeing with Dr. Craig out of principle. And yes, he had a lot of reasons for rejecting Dr. Craig, but the reasons themselves, they didn't mesh well together. And it just seemed like he was bringing up as many contrary positions as possible and shotgunned it to see if any one of them would stick, even if they didn't really mesh well together within any particular worldview. So like you're going to find a lot of atheists, as soon as they see arguments or evidence for the existence of God, get really hostile. And that just provides us with opportunity to exercise Christian-like love and to just provide reasons for why we believe. It's like, hey, I am not trying to persuade you. I am trying to tell you why I believe and why I defend Christianity, because I believe that is the most reasonable worldview, most plausible for these reasons. And you are free to reject them, but you don't need to be hostile with me. And there's no excuse for a Christian to ever get hostile. So make sure that you're, as I've been saying, being gentle and respectful. I know that I need to work on that a lot. So, Dr. Craig continues, all this underscores the importance of having these brief arguments memorized. Doing so will help you to stay on track. In response to your question, which premise do you reject and why, the unbeliever is apt to say something like, I think religion is all just in your head, or religion has done more harm to society than anything else. Don't get distracted. Say, I understand that's how you feel, but you said there's no evidence for God. So I want to know which premises in my argument you reject and why. Just try to get him to engage. Eventually, you may get to the point where you can say to him, I don't think you really reject God because of the lack of evidence. I sense a deeper emotional rejection of God going on here. What's the real reason you reject God? At that point, you've moved beyond apologetics into personal counseling. My point is that having a few arguments in hand will completely invalidate the atheist's main reason for unbelief, that there's no evidence for God's existence. Of course, even if there's no evidence for God's existence, that's no proof that God does not exist. An Australian forensic scientist I met while lecturing in Sydney told me that there's a saying beloved by criminologists. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. A suspect might still be the murderer even if there's no evidence that he is. To rule him out, you need an alibi. That is positive evidence that he did not commit the crime. To rule out God's existence, the atheist needs more than just absence of evidence. He needs some positive evidence of absence. Atheism redefined as absence of belief. Very often atheists themselves admit that they have no evidence of God's absence, but they try to put a different spin on it. They'll tell you no one can prove a universal negative, like there is no God. They think this somehow excuses them from needing evidence against God's existence. But not only is it false that you can't prove a universal negative, all you have to do is show something is self-contradictory. But more importantly, this claim is really an admission that it's impossible to prove atheism. Atheism involves a universal negative. You can't prove a universal negative, therefore, atheism is unprovable. It turns out that it is the atheist who is believing a view for which there is and can be no evidence. This argument ought to be part of the Christian's apologetic arsenal. What many atheists do at this point is to revise the definition of atheism so that it's no longer the view that God does not exist, but becomes merely the absence of belief in God. Anyone who lacks a belief in God counts as an atheist. Key terms. So on theism, the theist says God exists. On atheism, atheists say God does not exist. Agnosticism, an agnostic says God may or may not exist. Okay, so there's a lack of knowledge or belief. Gnosis is knowledge, so they're saying they lack knowledge in God's existence. So this is not only contrary to the traditional meaning of the word, but it is really hopeless as a definition. For on this new definition, atheism is no longer a viewpoint or position. Rather, it's just a description of someone's psychological state, namely, the state of lacking a belief in God. As such, atheism is neither true nor false, and even babies turn out to be atheists. But can you imagine the following conversation between two young mothers? Brooke: Julie, I heard that you had twins. Congratulations. Julie: yes, thank you, but it's so sad. Brooke: what is it? Julie: well, they're both atheists. I love Dr. Craig, but I'm not a big fan of these things that he does here. On this redefinition, even our cat Muff, who I'm sure has never even thought about the question, turns out to be an atheist. Is Muff an atheist? All of this still leaves us wondering whether or not God exists. Call it atheism or schmatheism. What we want to know is if God exists. And anyone who says that he does not needs to have some evidence or arguments for his position. All right, so I feel like I need to talk about this a little bit. It's my opinion that we should just... I think it's a waste of time to debate about definitions of words and terms. I think it's better to just grant the terminology presented by the person that you're talking with and just move on. Dr. Craig seems to think that only people who make claims require evidence, but even if you have a lack of belief in something, there are situations in which a lack of belief requires justification. For example, if somebody came up to me and said, Simon, I have a lack of belief that the earth is round, my very first question would be to ask why. And me asking why is me trying to get them to provide justification for their lack of belief in the earth being round. It could be as simple as I've never seen any evidence, and then you can be like, well, look at these pictures, look at these scientists, look at all this stuff that talks about the earth being round, look at these shadows at different parts of the earth at the same time of day, and things of that nature, and then at that point they need to provide more justification than just a lack of evidence, because they've been presented evidence. So especially if nowadays, with everything that we've been raised with, if this is a modern person and they say I have a lack of belief in the earth being round, I would need some justification for that lack of belief. Like, why do you not believe the earth is round? You know what I'm saying? So, and that's how it is with atheism as well. There needs to be, when I met atheists for the first time, the people who are staunch atheists in the Navy, my very first question as a Christian at that point was to ask why. Why? And that is like I said, that is seeking justification. They need justification for their lack of belief. And when they say there is no evidence, that is them trying to provide justification. But that is not sufficient justification. Okay. So, Dr. Craig continues with this section, the argument from suffering. So we're finally getting into the problem of evil. Thoughtful atheists do try to provide arguments against God's existence. Undoubtedly, the most important of these is the problem of suffering. When you consider the extent and depth of suffering in the world, whether due to natural disasters or to man's own inhumanity to man, then you have to admit that it's hard to believe in God. The horrible suffering in the world certainly seems to be evidence of God's absence. In 1985, when Jen and I were living just outside Paris, the problem of suffering was brought home to me in a powerful way by two incidents shown on French television. In Mexico City, a terrible earthquake had devastated blocks of high-rise apartment buildings. As rescue teams in the aftermath of the quake searched the rubble for survivors, they came across a 10-year-old boy who was trapped alive somewhere in the recesses of a collapsed building. During the next several days, the whole world watched in agony as the teams tried to remove the rubble to get to the boy. They could communicate with him, but they could not reach him. His grandfather, who had been trapped with them, was already dead. "I'm scared," he cried. After about 11 days, there was silence. Alone in the darkness, trapped without food and water, afraid, the little boy died before the rescue teams could free him. That same year, a mudslide swept over a village in Colombia. As the rescuers came to help survivors, they came across a little girl who was pinned up to her chin in muddy water. For some reason or other, they could not free her or remove the water. All they could do was stand by helplessly and watch her die. Every night on the news, we saw a film of the little girl's decline. It was the most pathetic sight I had ever seen. She stood there, unable to move, spitting out the water, and continually flowed into her mouth. As the days went by, she became more exhausted. Deep black circles formed under her eyes. She was dying before our very eyes as we watched on television. Finally, the evening newscaster reported that she was gone. Those two incidents rent my heart. Oh God, I thought, how could you permit those children to die like that? If they had to die, so be it, but you could have let the boy be killed instantly by the collapse of the building, or let the little girl drown suddenly. Why these torturous, pointless, lingering deaths? I'll be honest with you. When I see these sorts of things go on, it makes it hard to believe in God. But as one colleague once wisely remarked to me, as a philosopher, I'm called upon to say what I think about some question, not how I feel about it. And as difficult as the problem of suffering may be emotionally, there's no reason in and of itself to think that God does not exist. So Do says, yeah, but if they say the definition of round is flat, then the definition becomes important. Yep, definitions become important. You have to agree to terms, but with regard to atheists trying to label themselves, or, I don't see much point in debating them on how they're trying to label themselves. They're trying to express as accurately as possible how their position. So I think that it's just right to grant it to them. But with regard to the versions of the problem of suffering, Dr. Craig continues, so in dealing with this emotionally loaded topic, it's crucial that we make a number of distinctions to keep our thinking clear. Like I said earlier in the stream, the problem of evil can be separated into categories. The first one on the right there is the emotional problem, and then the intellectual problem. And then the intellectual problem can be further split into the evidential version and the logical version. And we'll be getting into those, obviously. So, first and foremost, we must distinguish between the intellectual problem posed by suffering and the emotional problem posed by suffering. The intellectual version concerns whether it's plausible to think that God and suffering can coexist. The emotional problem concerns the emotional problem concerns people's dislike of a God who would permit suffering. So talk about it. Have you experienced serious suffering? How does your experience of suffering or relative lack of experience with it affect the way you think about the problem of suffering? So I have personally experienced what I would consider suffering, pretty bad suffering. Suffering, I have a tendency to lean more into God when I suffer. When I was younger, I was more of like my mom would call them fair water Christians or stormy weather Christians. And I was definitely a stormy weather Christian. If I was going through trouble, I was praying, So for me in particular, suffering has a tendency to make me seek God for help and aid and comfort and those things. So, but that doesn't mean that the problem of evil has never impacted my faith, because when I studied the problem of evil intellectually, I discovered that it was a very difficult problem. Now I'm no longer troubled by the problem of evil, but when I first started studying this was something that I had to overcome through study, prayer, and meditation. And just letting it marinate and coming and studying it. I read a lot of books on the problem of evil and how to combat it and things. And I have formed a response that to me is intellectually satisfying. And I often try to help people discover this themselves. I haven't really had any, the only mentor I've ever had in my Christian walk really is like God. So I try to help other people with this topic as well now. But yeah, let me know what you guys think as far as suffering and how it's impacted your belief in the existence of God, and or how it's impacted how you behave and things of that nature. But if there's nothing else, I can continue with, so Dr. Craig continues with, it's vital that we keep these problems distinct because the answer to the intellectual problem will doubtless seem dry and uncaring to the person who is struggling with the emotional problem. And the answer to the emotional problem will probably seem superficial and weak to anyone who's contemplating suffering as an abstract philosophical question. I'm concerned that for most people, the terrible suffering in the world is really an emotional, not an intellectual problem. Their unbelief is born out of a refutation, but not out of a refutation, but out of a rejection. They just want nothing to do with a God who would allow them and others to suffer terribly. But in order to support my claim that suffering poses mainly an emotional problem, we need to examine the detail of the intellectual problem to show that it fails as a proof of atheism. So, diving into the intellectual problem of suffering. Now, in discussing the intellectual problem of suffering, it's important that we keep in mind who has the burden of proof here. In the previous chapters, we were considering arguments for God, and so it was the believer who had to bear the burden of proof. But now, it's the atheist's turn. We're considering arguments for atheism. We want to hear from the atheist some arguments against God. So now it's the atheist who must shoulder the burden of proof. It's up to him to give us an argument leading to the conclusion, therefore God does not exist. I want to pause here real quick and just to let you guys know that many atheists that you're going to interact with are not going to say that this is an argument against God's existence. They're going to say that this argument is only geared towards a God that is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good. And they're going to say like omnibenevolent or all good. And there's going to be a lot of keywords and tricky phrases in there that that would actually make this argument effective against particular versions of that kind of God. But we're going to continue with what Dr. Craig is presenting here as presenting this problem of evil as an argument against God's existence, because this omni-God, this omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly holy God, as I like to say, is the only God that we really care about as Christians, since that's the one we believe in. So too often believers allow unbelievers to shift the burden of proof to the believer's shoulders. Give us some good explanation for why God permits suffering, the unbeliever will demand, and then he sits back and plays a skeptic about all the believer's attempted explanations. The atheist winds up having to prove nothing. This may be a clever debating strategy on the atheist's part, but it's philosophically illegitimate and intellectually dishonest. Don't allow the atheist to shirk his intellectual responsibilities. He's the one who claims that the coexistence of God and suffering is impossible or improbable. So it's up to him to give us argument and to support his premises. It's the Christian's turn to play the skeptic and to question whether the atheist has shown that God cannot have or does not have a good reason for permitting the suffering in the world. Insists that the atheist bears his share of the burden of proof when it's his turn to present his case against God. The intellectual problem of suffering comes in two versions. The logical version tries to show that the coexistence of God with suffering is logically impossible. The evidential version tries to show that the coexistence of God and suffering is highly improbable. Now, before you begin to talk to the unbeliever about the problem of suffering, you need to find out which version he's supporting. So just ask him, are you saying that it's impossible for God and suffering in the world to both exist, or are you saying that it's merely improbable that God and suffering both exist? If he's like most atheists, he's probably never thought about it, and so doesn't have a clue. You may need to help him clarify what he himself believes by explaining the two versions to him. What he believes will then determine your response. So the logical version this is saying it's logically impossible for God and suffering to coexist. According to the logical version of the problem, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. They are like the irresistible force and the immovable object. If one exists, then the other does not. Since suffering obviously exists, it follows that God does not exist. The key to this argument is the atheist's claim that it's impossible that God and suffering both exist. The atheist is claiming that the following two statements are logically inconsistent. 1, an all-loving, all-powerful God exists. 2, suffering exists. Now the obvious question is, why think that these two statements are logically inconsistent? There's no explicit contradiction between them. One statement is not the direct opposite of the other. So if the atheist thinks there's some hidden implicit contradiction between them, he must be making some hidden assumptions that would serve to bring out the contradiction and make it explicit. So the question is, what are those hidden assumptions? There seems to be two hidden assumptions made by the atheist. There are 3. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world that he wants. And 4, if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. The argument here is that God is all-loving and all-powerful. Therefore, he both can and wants to create a world without suffering. Therefore, it follows that the world has no suffering. But that contradicts 2. Suffering exists. Therefore, God must not exist. In order for this argument to show a logical inconsistency between statements 1 and 2, both of the hidden assumptions made by the atheist must be necessarily true. But are they? Consider 3. That if God is all-powerful, he can create any world that he wants. Is that necessarily true? Well, not if it's possible that people have free will. It's logically impossible to make someone do something freely. That is as logically impossible as making a round square or a married bachelor. God's being all-powerful does not mean that he can bring about the logically impossible. Indeed, there is no such thing as the logically impossible. It's just an inconsistent combination of words. If the unbeliever insists that an all-powerful being can do the logically impossible, then the problem of suffering evaporates immediately, for then God can bring it about that he and suffering both exist, even though this is logically impossible. Since it's possible that people have free will, it turns out that 3 is not necessarily true. For if people have free will, they may refuse to do what God desires. So there will be any number of possible worlds that God cannot create because the people in them wouldn't cooperate with God's desires. In fact, for all we know, it's possible that in any world of free persons, such as with as much good as this world, there would also be as much suffering. This conjecture need not be true or even probable, but so long as it's even logically possible, it shows that it is not necessarily true that God can create any world that he wants. So assumption 3 is not necessarily true. On this basis alone, the atheist's argument is logically fallacious. So freedom of the will. The notion of freedom under discussion here is called libertarian freedom. Some philosophers say that the essence of libertarian freedom is the ability to choose between action A or not A in the same circumstances. An arguably better analysis of libertarian freedom sees its essence in the absence of causal determination of a person's choice apart from the person's own causal activity. That is to say, causes other than the person himself do not determine how that person chooses in some set of circumstances. It is up to him how he chooses. This concept of freedom is very different from the voluntarist or compatibilist view, which defines freedom in terms of voluntary or non-coerced action, so that an action's being causally determined is compatible with its being free. The notion of freedom operative in this chapter is libertarian freedom, which precludes God's determining how we shall freely choose. Hope you guys got that. But what about assumption 4? That if God is all loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Is that necessarily true? It doesn't seem like it, for God could have overriding reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. We all know cases in which we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good, like taking our child to the dentist. The atheist might insist that an all-powerful being would not be so limited. He could bring about the greater good directly, without allowing any suffering. But clearly, given freedom of the will, that may not be possible. Some good, for example, moral virtues, can be achieved only through the free cooperation of people. It may well be the case that a world with suffering is, on balance, better overall than a world with no suffering. In any case, it is at least possible, and that is sufficient to defeat the atheist's claim that 4 is necessarily true. The point is that the atheist, in asserting 3 and 4, has taken on a burden of proof so heavy that it's unsustainable. He would have to show that free will is impossible and that it's impossible that a world with suffering would be better than a world with no suffering. We can push the argument a notch further. We can make it plausible that God and suffering are logically consistent. All we have to do is come up with a statement that is consistent with God's existence and entails that suffering exists. Here is such a statement. 5. God could not have created another world with as much good as, but less suffering than this world, and God has good reasons for permitting the suffering that exists. The idea here is that given human freedom, God's options are restricted, and it may be that a world with as much good as the actual world, but with less suffering, wasn't an option. Nevertheless, God has good reasons for the suffering he allows. If statements 5 is even possibly true, it shows that it's possible that God and suffering both exist, and it surely is plausible that 5 is possibly true. I'm therefore very pleased to report that after centuries of discussion, the books on the logical version of the problem of suffering have been closed. It's widely admitted by both the atheists and Christian philosophers alike that the logical version of the problem of suffering has failed. The burden of proof it lays on the atheist's shoulders, namely trying to show that the coexistence of God and suffering is impossible, is just too heavy to bear. So, with that said, we move on to the evidential version. It's improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting suffering. But we're not out of the woods yet. For now, we come to the evidential problem of suffering, which is still very much a live issue. The atheistic claim here is that the suffering in the world renders it improbable that God exists. In particular, it seems highly improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. So much of that suffering appears to be utterly pointless and unnecessary. Surely God could have reduced the suffering in the world without reducing the world's overall goodness. So the suffering in the world provides evidence that there is no God. This is a much more powerful version of the argument than the logical version, since its conclusion is more modest, namely that it's improbable that God exists, and the atheist's burden of proof is much lighter. So what can be said in response to this argument? I'll make 3 main points. So human limitations is the first one. First, we're not in a position to say that it's improbable that God lacks good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. And I think that this needs to be stressed, so definitely highlight this. I should highlight it in my book, but I'll get to it later. The key to the evidential argument is the atheist claim that God doesn't have good reasons for permitting the suffering that occurs. Now, we all recognize that much of the suffering in the world looks unjustified. We see neither its point nor its necessity. The success of the atheist argument will depend on whether we're warranted in inferring that because the suffering looks unjustified, it really is unjustified. My first point is that we're just not in a position to make that kind of judgment with any confidence. As finite persons, we're limited in space and time, in intelligence and insight, but God sees the end of history from its beginning and providentially orders history to his ends through humans' free decisions and actions. In order to achieve his purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering that appears pointless within our limited framework may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework. I'll give 2 illustrations of this point. One from contemporary science and one from popular culture. First illustration. In the so-called chaos theory, scientists have discovered that certain large-scale systems, for example, the weather or insect populations, are extraordinarily sensitive to the smallest disturbances. A butterfly fluttering on a twig in West Africa may set in motion forces that will eventually issue in a hurricane over the Atlantic Ocean. Yet it's impossible for anyone observing that butterfly fluttering on the branch to predict such an outcome. We have no way of knowing how the alteration of some seemingly insignificant event can radically alter the world. Second illustration. The movie Sliding Doors, starring Gwyneth Paltrow, tells the story of a young woman who is rushing down the stairs to the subway to catch a train. As she nears the train, the movie splits into 2 paths her life might take. In the one life, the doors to the train slide shut just before she can board. In the other life, she makes it through the doors just before they close. Based on this seemingly trivial event, the 2 paths of her life increasingly diverge. In the one, she's enormously successful, prosperous, and happy. In the other life, she encounters failure, misery, and unhappiness. And all because of a split-second difference in getting through the subway doors. Moreover, that difference is due to whether a little girl playing with her doll on the stair railing is snatched away by her father or momentarily blocks the woman's path as she hurries down the stairs to catch the train. We can't help but wonder about the innumerable other trivialities that led up to that event. Whether the father and his daughter were delayed leaving the house that morning because she didn't like the cereal her mother gave her for breakfast, whether the man had been inattentive to his daughter because his thoughts were preoccupied by something he had read in the newspaper, and so on. But the most interesting part is the film's ending. Spoiler alert. In the happy, successful life, the woman is suddenly killed in an accident, while the other life turns around, and the life of hardship and suffering turns out to be the truly good life after all. My point is obviously not that things always turn out for the best in this earthly life. No, my point is much more modest. Given the dizzying complexity of life, we are simply in no position at all to judge that God has no good reasons for permitting some instance of suffering to afflict our lives. Every event that occurs sends a ripple effect through history, such that God's reason for permitting it might not emerge until centuries later, and perhaps in another country. Only an all-knowing God could grasp the complexities of directing a world of free people toward his envisioned goals. Just thinking of the innumerable and incalculable events involved in arriving at a single historical event, say the Allied victory at D-Day, we have no idea of what suffering might be involved in order for God to achieve some intended purpose through the freely chosen actions of human persons. Nor should we expect to discern God's reasons for permitting suffering. It's hardly surprising that such suffering seems pointless and unnecessary for us, for we are overwhelmed by such complexity. So talk about it. So, is it helpful for you personally to understand that God may have good reasons for allowing some painful event that seems pointless? Please explain. Yes, definitely. So this is my preferred route for addressing the problem of evil, and I think that all responses to the problem of evil ultimately kind of fall on this. This is kind of like what's called skeptical theism or theistic skepticism, in which you can say that I highly doubt that a omniscient and omnipotent and perfectly good or perfectly holy God does not have morally sufficient justification for actualizing a world that contains this much suffering. You know, we are so finite. Our knowledge, as Dr. Craig rightly points out, is extremely finite. It's extremely limited. We don't even know we don't even have perfect knowledge of what's going on within ourselves or our own character, our own minds, or, you know, like I have knowledge of what's basic knowledge of what's going on within 3 feet of me. You know, I have no idea what's happening upstairs in my house right now. I can hear what's going on. I have a general feel for what's going on, but I don't know what's going on. And then once you go outside the house, no idea what's going on, you know? And I think a lot of people fail to recognize how limited we are. And that coupled with the fact that we are morally imperfect creatures, we simply do not have a perfect grasp of the moral landscape. So not only are we poorly positioned to judge God's actions and intentions from what we know, we're also poorly positioned to judge God's actions from a moral standpoint. So so what I also think that this response to the problem of evil is the response that God himself gives to Job at the end of the book of Job. And so I think it's an intellectually viable option, since, you know, God's the one that provided it. But I could go on and on about this, but I think that the best thing for any person to do is to have, and we kind of are forced to do this, so we have to have faith that God has good intentions and knows exactly what he's doing. We have to have faith in that. And I think that God has provided us with sufficient justification to warrant belief that he is both trustworthy and that he has good intentions. So let me know what you guys think. Du says, "Oh, for sure. I wish I knew the reasons. Sometimes it would be, you know, a lot of people with regard to the reasons God permits or the reasons why God actualizes a world that contains this much suffering, or why this suffering exists. I don't think it would help us that much. It might help some of us to better, if we're already aligned with trusting God, to better appreciate his knowledge. But a lot of non-Christians are like, I want to know God's reasons. I don't see why God should give you his reasons, because even if God gives you all of his reasons for actualizing a world that contains the suffering that you're concerned about, and you disagree with God, you're just wrong. You know, like, you are just wrong. That's just the way that it is. So if you disagree, it's irrelevant. You know, it doesn't matter if you know everything and end up disagreeing, because you're not morally perfect and you're not omniscient, you know? So, so it's not enough to know God's reasons, you know? But yeah, so Dr. Craig continues in the book. So this is not to appeal to mystery, but rather to point to our inherent limitations, which make it impossible for us to say, when confronted with some example of suffering, that God probably has no good reason. That God probably has no good reason for permitting it to occur. Unbelievers themselves recognize these limitations in other contexts. For example, one of the decisive objections to utilitarianism, the theory of ethics that says that we should do whatever brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, is that we have no idea of the ultimate outcome of our actions. Some short-term good might actually lead to untold misery, while some action that looks disastrous in the short term may bring about the greatest good. We don't have a clue. Once we contemplate God's providence over the whole of human history, I think you can see how hopeless it is for finite, limited observers to speculate about the probability that God has a good reason for the suffering we observe. We simply are not in a position to assess such probabilities with any confidence. All right, so the full scope of the evidence. Second, relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence is probable. Probabilities are always relative to some background information. For example, suppose we're given the information that Joe is a college student and that 90% of college students drink beer. Relative to that information, it's highly probable that Joe drinks beer. But now suppose we're given the additional information that Joe is a student at Wheaton College and that 90% of Wheaton students do not drink beer. Relative to this new information, it now becomes highly improbable that Joe is a beer drinker. To repeat, probabilities are relative to background information. Now the atheist says God's existence is improbable. You should immediately ask, improbable relative to what? What is the background information? The suffering in the world? If that's all the background information you're considering, then it's no wonder God's existence looks improbable relative to that. Though, as I've just argued, appearances can be deceiving. But that's not the really interesting question. The interesting question is whether God's existence is probable relative to the full scope of the evidence. I'm convinced that whatever improbability suffering may cast upon God's existence, it's outweighed by the arguments for the existence of God. Consider, in particular, the moral argument. Much of the suffering in the world consists of evil acts that people perpetrate upon one another. But then we may argue as follows. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2. Evil exists. 3. Therefore, objective moral values exist. Some things are evil. 4. Therefore, God exists. All right, so talk about it. If God doesn't exist, then suffering may be painful, but it isn't bad in a moral sense. Why then are even atheists aware that tragic events are bad? Recall this subject from Chapter 6. So, Chapter 6 dealt with the moral argument. So what you can do is say that, well, you can use the existence of evil against the atheists and say, well, the evil in the world actually lends evidence to God's existence via the moral argument. Because if there are instances of objective evil, then that's better explained by the existence of God. Now, there are going to be a lot of atheists out there who will, and non-Christians, who will say that we are granting on your worldview. We're saying they're doing a reductio ad absurdum, basically, where they're taking our worldview and using it against us. They're saying if your worldview were true, then it leads to a contradiction. Namely, the amount of suffering is incompatible with a loving God. So So I personally have a tendency not to go the moral argument route in response to this for that reason. But if there is an atheist who definitely does believe in objective morality, then I will sometimes go the moral argument route. But it depends on the context, Depends on the situation, depends on the person, that kind of stuff. I have a tendency to just when we talk about objective morality, to say that the Christian worldview offers a better explanatory scope regarding the features of the moral landscape than atheistic worldviews, especially with regard to moral accountability and moral motivation. Okay. So there's literally nothing a non-Christian worldview has that provides more moral motivation, and nothing that provides more moral accountability. Every feature of moral accountability on a non-theistic worldview that includes objective moral values and duties are available in the Christian's worldview. So there's no benefit to it. All right. The only benefit is from the atheist perspective is that God isn't a part of it. That's the only benefit. All right, so Dr. Craig continues. Although at a superficial level, suffering calls into question God's existence, at a deeper level, suffering actually proves God's existence. For apart from God, suffering is not really bad. If the atheist believes that suffering is bad or ought not to be, then he's making moral judgments that are possible only if God exists. What you need to understand is that most people who write about the problem of suffering are tacitly assuming that there are no good arguments for the existence of God. So, for them, the question is whether suffering makes atheism probable, given that there's nothing on the other side of the scale. But I think there are very weighty arguments for God on the other side of the scale. Therefore, I could concede that God's existence is improbable relative to the suffering in the world alone, but point out that this is just outweighed by the arguments for God's existence. So we're up to another talk about it. Which do you tend to value more, temporal happiness or knowledge of God? How does this affect your actions and reactions? For me, it depends on the day. I wish that I could always say knowledge of God is the thing that I value most, because I truly believe that if you are a Christian, then you will value and love God more than anything else in existence, up to including all of everything else in existence. So you love God more than any of that. But I certainly do not live that way every day. There are days in which I'm good and I am seeking the knowledge of God, meditating on His Word, praying, studying my Bible, studying the worldview of Christianity and sharpening my understanding of it, and becoming more effective at addressing argumentations and claims that rebut the worldview of Christianity. But there are also days in which I live for myself, But I do know that the days in which I focus on my calling from God and focus on my relationship with God and do my spiritual disciplines, I can sense that my actions and my reactions are wiser, more gracious, more loving, and superior. And so I wish that I did that more frequently, but I am still I'm still in the midst of the process of sanctification, becoming holier every day, hopefully. Sometimes it's going up, sometimes it's going down, but hopefully it's always an increasing trajectory. All right, so let me know what you guys think, and don't hesitate to comment. I really appreciate it when you guys interact. So Dr. Craig continues. Suffering makes more sense under Christian doctrine. Third, Christianity entails a doctrine that increases the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. If the Christian God exists, then it's not so improbable that suffering should also exist. It actually turns out that the problem of suffering is easier to deal with given the Christian God rather than some bare-bones concept of God. For Christianity entails certain doctrines that increase the probability of suffering. What are these doctrines? Let me mention 4. Number 1, the chief purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. One reason that the problem of suffering seems so puzzling is that people naturally tend to assume that if God exists, then his purpose for human life is happiness in this life. God's role is to provide a comfortable environment for his human pets. But on the Christian view, this is false. We are not God's pets, and the goal of human life is not happiness per se, but the knowledge of God, which in the end will bring true and everlasting human fulfillment. Much of the suffering in life may be utterly pointless with respect to the goal of producing human happiness, but it may not be pointless with respect to producing a deeper knowledge of God. So wealth and health. The wealth and health gospel and the gospel of positive thinking that are being proclaimed at various megachurches and denominations are false gospels that are setting people up for a fall. That kind of gospel won't preach at Darfur or in Iraq or in 1,000 other places. And if it won't preach there, it isn't the true gospel. We need to understand that God's plan for human history may involve terrible suffering for us, whose point or reason we can't expect to see. Our hope lies not in worldly happiness, but in the day when God will wipe away every tear. Innocent human suffering provides an occasion for deeper intimacy and trust in God, either on the part of the sufferer or those around him. Of course, whether God's purpose is achieved through our suffering will depend on our response. Do we respond with anger and bitterness towards God, or do we turn to him in faith for strength to endure? Because God's ultimate goal for humanity is the knowledge of himself, which alone can bring eternal happiness to people. History cannot be seen in its true perspective apart from the kingdom of God. The purpose of human history is the kingdom of God. God's desire is to draw freely as many people as he can into his everlasting kingdom. It may well be the case that suffering is part of the means God uses to draw people freely into his kingdom. A reading of a missions handbook, such as Patrick Johnstone's Operation World, reveals that it is precisely in countries that have endured severe hardship that Christianity is growing at its greatest rates, while growing curves in the indulgent West are while growth curves in the indulgent West are nearly flat. Consider, for example, the following reports. China. It is estimated that 20 million Chinese lost their lives during Mao's Cultural Revolution. Christians stood firm on what was probably the most widespread and harsh persecution of the church the church has ever experienced. The persecution purified and indigenized the church. Since 1977, the growth of the church in China has no parallels in history. Researchers estimate that there were 30 to 75 million Christians by 1990. Mao Zedong unwittingly became the greatest evangelist in history. El Salvador. The 12-year civil war, earthquakes, and the collapse of the price of coffee, the nation's main export, impoverished the nation. Over 80% live in dire poverty. An astonishing spiritual harvest has been gathered from all strata of society in the midst of the hate and bitterness of war. In 1960, evangelicals were 2.3% of the population, but today are around 20%. Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in a state of shock. Her population struggles with the trauma of millions of deaths through repression, famine, and war. Two great waves of violent persecution refined and purified the church, but there were many martyrs. There have been millions coming to Christ. Protestants were fewer than 0.8% of the population in 1960, but by 1990, this may have become 13% of the population. Examples of these could be multiplied. The history of mankind has been a history of suffering and war, yet it has also been a history of the advance of the kingdom of God. Figure 2 in the chart released in 1990 by the U.S. Center of World Missions documents the growth of the number of committed Christians over the centuries. So the ratio of committed Christians to non-Christians over history, neither category includes merely nominal Christians. Even if all of them were included with the non-Christians, there would still today be only about 9 non-believers for every committed believer in the world. All right, so there's the chart. Let me see if I can increase the... There. So you can better see the chart now. But yeah, so this is talking about the ratio of non-Christians to Christians. And in AD, 100 AD, it was like 360, and it just keeps dropping down. And this is the ratio. Okay. So according to Johnstone, we are living in the time of the largest ingathering of people into the kingdom of God that the world has ever seen. It's not at all improbable that this astonishing growth in God's kingdom is due in part to the presence of suffering in the world. Number 2, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Rather than submit to and worship God, people rebel against God and go their own way, and so find themselves alienated from God, morally guilty before him, groping in spiritual darkness and pursuing false gods of their own making. The terrible human evils in the world are testimony to man's depravity in his state of spiritual alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at the moral evils in the world. On the contrary, he expects it. The scriptures indicate that God has given mankind up to the sin it has freely chosen. He doesn't interfere to stop it, but lets human depravity run its course. This only serves to heighten mankind's moral responsibility before God, as well as our wickedness and our need for forgiveness and moral cleansing. So in accordance with Romans chapter 1, 24 through 26 and 28, so God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. As a result, they did vile and degrading things with each other's bodies. They traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshipped and served the things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. Amen. That is why God abandoned them to their shameful desires. Since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, he abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. Number 3, God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. According to Christianity, this life is but the cramped and narrow foyer opening up into the great hall of God's eternity. God promises eternal life to all who place their trust in Christ as Savior and Lord. When God asks his children to bear horrible suffering in this life, it is only with the prospect of heavenly joy and recompense that is beyond all comprehension. The Apostle Paul underwent a life of incredible suffering. His life as an apostle was punctuated by afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, tumults, labors, watching, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul lived this life in the perspective of eternity. He understood that the length of this life, being finite, is literally infinitesimal in comparison to the eternal life we'll spend with God. The longer we spend in eternity, the more the sufferings of this life will shrink by comparison toward an infinitesimal moment. That's why Paul called the sufferings of this life a slight momentary affliction. He wasn't being insensitive to the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. On the contrary, he was one of those people. But he saw that those sufferings were simply overwhelmed by the ocean of everlasting joy and glory that God will give to those who trust him. It may well be that there is suffering in the world that serves no earthly good at all. that is entirely pointless from a human point of view, but which God permits simply that he might overwhelmingly reward in the afterlife those who undergo such suffering in faith and confidence in God. Number 4, the knowledge of God is an incommensurate good. The passage cited from Paul also serves to make this point. Paul imagines, as it were, a scale in which all the suffering of this life is placed on one side, while on the other side is placed the glory that God will bestow upon his children in heaven. And the weight of glory is so great that it is beyond comparison with the suffering. So, to know God, the locus of infinite goodness and love, is an incomparable good, the fulfillment of human existence. The sufferings of this life cannot even be compared to it. Thus, the person who knows God, no matter what he suffers, no matter how awful his pain, can still truly say, God is good to me, simply by virtue of the fact that he knows God, an incommensurable good. These 4 Christian doctrines increase the probability of the coexistence of God and the suffering in the world. They in turn decrease any improbability that suffering might seem to cast upon God, the existence of God. The atheists may respond at this point that we have no reason to think that these 4 Christian doctrines are true. Whoa, he's trying to shift the burden of proof again. It's the atheist who claims that the suffering makes God's existence improbable. It's entirely legit for you to say, not the Christian God. The atheist needs to show that the Christian God is improbable relative to the suffering in the world. So he needs to show either that these doctrines are probably false, or else show that God's existence is improbable, even given the truth of these doctrines. He has the burden of proof in either case. Don't let him foist it on you. All right, so a recap of the doctrines about God and suffering. These 4 doctrines increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Number 1, the chief purpose of life, and this is important. The chief purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. Number 2, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Number 3, God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. Number 4, the knowledge of God is an incommensurable good. So let's return then to the 2 incidents that so powerfully portrayed to me the promised suffering. The Mexican boy who slowly died from the collapse of a building, and the Colombian girl who drowned in the aftermath of a mudslide. In the first place, both incidents concern natural disasters intertwined with human moral sin. The whole of Latin America has been victimized by an unjust and uncaring upper class, which has, in its lust for power and wealth, exploited the masses, leaving them poor and underprivileged. The suffering of those 2 children is indirectly attributed to this corruption and unchristian system. For if the societies in which the children lived were following Christian principles, their families would not have been forced to live in unsafe housing that was improperly located or so poorly built that it disintegrated under the stress of earthquake or rain. In a world free of sin, it's possible that neither of these tragedies would have taken place. Hence, given a Christian doctrine of sin and mankind's fallen state, such tragedies are not surprising. Why did God permit these children to suffer so? We are in no position to know. Perhaps through the tragic death of this boy, God knew Mexican authorities would be shocked into requiring new construction standards for earthquake-proof buildings, thereby saving many future lives. Maybe he let it happen because the authorities should be so shocked. Maybe he permitted it so that some other person facing death or illness in a hospital and seeing the reports on television would be inspired by the boy's courage to face his own challenge with faith and bravery. Maybe God permitted the Colombian girl to slowly drown because he knew that only then would her family or someone else turn to him in faith for eternal life. Or perhaps he knew that only through such a terrible incident would her family move away to another place where they or even their descendants might in turn come to be influenced or to influence someone else for Christ. Given our inherent limitations, we can only guess. Therefore, the atheists cannot prove that it is either impossible or improbable that God had good reasons for permitting these events to occur. The problem for the atheist becomes even more acute when we reflect that perhaps there wasn't any earthly reason at all why God permitted those catastrophes. Maybe they served no earthly good whatsoever. Perhaps the catastrophes were simply the unfortunate byproduct of natural geological and meteorological laws, and the children their unlucky victims. But when the little girl and boy finally left this life and stepped into the next, Jesus enfolded them in his loving arms, wiped away their tears, and filled them with a glorious happiness beyond all expression, saying, "Well done, my child. Enter into the joy of your master." In that eternity of joy, they will know a weight of glory beyond all comparison with what he asked them to suffer here. So the response to the evidential argument, number one, we're not in a position to say that it's impossible or improbable that God lacks good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. Number two, relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's evidence is probable. Number three, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. In summary, the evidential version of the problem of suffering just can't be put through successfully. It requires probability judgments way beyond our ability. It fails to take into account the full scope of the evidence, and it is diminished in force when it comes to the Christian God. Since neither the logical nor the evidential version of the problem goes through, the intellectual problem of suffering fails as a disproof of God. All right, so now for the emotional problem of suffering. But when I say fails, I mean fails intellectually. The anguish of the problem of suffering and the gnawing doubt may still remain. That brings us back to the emotional problem of suffering. I've already said that for most people, suffering is not really an intellectual problem, but an emotional problem. You might be thinking, then why go through all this intellectual material if it's not really the problem? Oops. 2 reasons. First, people think their problem is intellectual, so by working through it, we can respect their opinion and help them see the real problem. Second, what I've shared can be a tremendous help to you when God calls upon you to go through suffering. And yes, I can tell you that it is extremely helpful. I've in the past 5 years, I've gone through some pretty intense suffering, and I can say that I've leaned heavily on what I've learned, and I can say I don't understand why God is actualize a world in which I have experienced this and have gone through this kind of suffering, but I know that God has a good reason for it. And I have faith in God for that there's some good that can be brought out of this. All right, so Dr. Craig continues. So what can be said to those who are struggling with the emotional problem of suffering? In one sense, the most important thing may not be what one says at all. The most important thing may be just to be there as a loving friend and a sympathetic listener. But some people may need counsel, and we ourselves may need to deal with this problem when we suffer. Does the Christian faith also have the resources to deal with this problem as well? It certainly does, for it tells us that God is not a distant creator or impersonal ground of being, but a loving Father who shares our suffering and hurts with us. On the cross, Christ endured a suffering beyond all understanding. He bore the punishment for the sins of the whole world. None of us can comprehend that suffering. Though he was innocent, he voluntarily underwent incomprehensible suffering for us. And why? Because he loves us so much. How can we reject him who gave up everything for us? When God asks us to undergo suffering that seems unmerited, pointless, and unnecessary, meditation upon the cross of Christ can help to give us the strength and courage needed to bear the cross that we are asked to carry. I mentioned earlier that knowing God is an incommensurable good to which our suffering cannot even be compared. Few of us really understand this truth, but a former colleague of mine got to know a woman who did. Tom used to make it a habit to visit shut-ins in nursing homes in an attempt to bring a bit of cheer and love into their lives. One day he met a woman whom he could never forget. As I neared the end of the hallway, I saw an old woman strapped up in a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and white pupils of her eyes told me that she was blind. The large hearing aid over one ear told me that she was almost deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discolored and running sore covering one part of a cheek. Part of one cheek, and it had pushed her nose to one side, dropped one eye, and distorted her jaw so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I also learned later that this woman was 89 years old and that she had been bedridden, blind, nearly deaf, and alone for 25 years. This was Mabel. I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most of the people I saw in that hallway. But I put a flower in her hand and said, "Here is a flower for you. Happy Mother's Day." She held the flower up to her face and tried to smell, and then she spoke. And much to my surprise, her words, although somewhat garbled because of her deformity, were obviously pronounced with it by a clear mind. She said, "Thank you, it's lovely, but can I give it to someone else? I can't see it, I'm blind." I said, "Of course." And I pushed her in her chair back down the hallway to a place where I thought I could find some alert patients. I found one and stopped the chair. Mabel held out the flower and said, "Here, this is from Jesus." Tom and Mabel became friends over the next few years. Tom began to realize that he was no longer helping Mabel, but she was helping him. He began to take notes on what she said. After a stressful week, Tom went to Mabel and asked her, "Mabel, what do you think about as you lie here all day?" She replied, "I think about my Jesus." I sat there and thought for a moment about the difficulty for me and to think about Jesus for even 5 minutes. And I asked, "What do you think about Jesus?" She replied slowly and deliberately as I wrote, and this is what she said: "I think how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me in my life, I'm one of those kind who's mostly satisfied. Lots of folk would think I'm kind of old-fashioned, but I don't care. I'd rather have Jesus. He's all the world to me." And then Mabel began to sing an old hymn. "Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He is my strength from day to day. Without him, I would fall. When I'm sad, to him I go. No other can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad. He is my friend." This is not fiction. Incredible as it may seem, a human being really lived like this. I knew her. How could she do it? Seconds ticked and minutes crawled, and so did days and weeks and months and years of pain without human company and without an explanation of why it was all happening. As she lay there and sang hymns, how could she do it? The answer, I think, is that Mabel had something that you and I don't have much of. She had power. Lying in that bed, unable to move, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to talk to anyone, she had incredible power. So, talk about it. How does Mabel's story affect you? What does Tom mean when he says she had power? So, this story impacts me strongly, I find it extremely commendable when people who are experiencing and undergoing a significant suffering do so with dignity and grace. I think it's extremely commendable. I find it very touching as well that, and to me, Mabel is evidence of what Tom talks about as power, is the power that God gives someone to overcome difficulties and struggles. So from my perspective, it seems like Mabel was given a dose of power from God that was greater than the suffering that she was enduring. And it speaks through this testimony of Tom. I think it makes it difficult for me to question God's existence or his intentions when I hear Mabel, like stories like Mabel. Dew says, "Now that is faith to move a mountain." Indeed, may we all likewise come to understand Jesus in such a way. May we want to seek God and Jesus and love him in that way. Very impressive to me. So Dr. Craig continues, paradoxically then, even though the problem of suffering is the greatest objection to the existence of God, at the end of the day, God is the only solution to the problem of suffering. This is extremely important. The problem of evil is not just a problem for theists who believe in some kind of omni-God. Everybody has to deal with the problem of evil. It may be formulated differently in different situations, but every worldview has to deal with the problem of evil. As a matter of fact, that's a major feature of religions. The observation that we have is that we suffer, and the answer provided by religions is how do we mitigate or overcome suffering, and other religions answer the question differently. In Hinduism, we suffer because we fail to recognize our own divinity. And how do you overcome suffering? You overcome suffering by recognizing your divinity. How do you overcome suffering in Buddhism? Why do you suffer in Buddhism? You suffer in Buddhism because you have attachments. So how do you overcome suffering in Buddhism? You no longer have any earthly attachments. Or why do we suffer in Islam? We suffer in Islam because we're not submitting to God. And so how do you get rid of suffering? You submit to God. In Christianity, why do we suffer? We suffer because sin has alienated us from God. So how do we overcome suffering? We overcome suffering by God reconciling us back to him. So we don't ever really overcome suffering, but God overcomes suffering for us. That's a big distinction from other religions. Like in other religions, it's always on the effort of the human, but on Christianity, it's all God's effort. Because one thing about suffering that we should come to recognize is that we can't overcome it by ourselves. Suffering is not something that we can overcome on our own. It requires something with much more power, and in this case, it's God. All right, anyway, sorry about that tangent. Dr. Craig continues, if God does not exist, then we are locked without hope in a world filled with pointless and unredeemed suffering. God is the final answer to the problem of suffering, for he redeems us from evil and takes us into everlasting joy of an incommensurable good, fellowship with himself. All right, so that was the conclusion. All right, so that means that we got the end of the chapter together. We get to celebrate. Yay! Celebration! Woo! And spooky music. Spooky time. Celebrating during spooky time. All right. So there is, even though there isn't a direct argument for the existence of God here, there's still an argument map. So let's go ahead and pop over to the argument map. Boom. All right. So the argument map here. All right, so number one, so remember that this is a atheistic argument, so the con is starting off. So what is being presented is either the logical version, or so for the logical version. The logical version, God exists and suffering exists, they are logically inconsistent. And then we can just say that there's no explicit contradiction here, so what do you mean by that? And then they'll say, well, there's an implicit contradiction. Since God is all good, and if there's evil, that means that God doesn't exist, because if God is all good, then there only would be good, that kind of stuff. And we say, well, no, there is no implicit contradiction, and no implicit contradiction has been proven. So a world with a suffering may be preferable to a world without suffering, or human freedom entails that God cannot create just any world he desires. And two, it is logically impossible to make someone freely do something. Okay, so this, just as a reminder, this is dealing with nuance and topics dealing with like libertarian free will and whether or not that legitimately does narrow the range of possible worlds for God, and whether or not libertarian free will is possible and things of that nature. So this, and I've said this in the past, remember, On Guard is an introduction. So we are just kind of scratching the surface here. But if you ever have any questions, reach out to me. Don't hesitate to call me or email me or text me through Facebook or email through my website. But yeah, we can have a lot of conversation about this. And I love these kinds of topics. So moving on. So with regard to the implicit contradiction, there's a proof that they are consistent. Possibly God could, so this was number 5. Possibly God could not create a world with this much good but less suffering, and God has good reasons for permitting this suffering. Okay, so that even if that's possible, then there is no contradiction. Okay, if it's logically possible, then it's not logically impossible. All right, moving on to the second one. So the evidential version: God exists and is improbable. God exists is improbable given the suffering of the world. It is improbable that God has good reasons for permitting suffering, and there's 3 ways that we can respond. We are not in a position to make such a probability judgment. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence is probable. Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of coexistence of God and suffering. And so he provides us with those 4 doctrines. Number 1, the purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. Number 2, mankind is in rebellion to God and his purpose. Number 3, God's purpose spills over into eternal life. Number 4, knowing God is an incomparable good. And then in response to the emotional problem, that atheism of rejection, we have to understand that God suffers. He's not some distant being, but he is a loving Father, and he suffers with us. Okay, we can meditate on the cross, that God gave up everything for us in order to reconcile us back to him, to demonstrate the extent of his forgiveness by the cross, and that by the means of the cross provide reconciliation to humanity. Okay. But yeah, so just a quick celebration again because we're officially done. Woohoo! All right, thanks for coming out with me, guys. And just as a reminder where I'm at, I know that we've been doing this book study for an hour, over an hour now, but just as a reminder, I'm still in jail. But I hope that you guys liked the stream today. I hope that this Halloween theme is seen. Yeah, dude says we did it. Woo! Get me out of here. Don't forget me. Pray for me. Don't despise these chains. But yeah. So great having you guys out. Really happy that we're able to have this time together and study this book on apologetics. I hope that it has edified you and increased your knowledge of God, which is an incommensurable good, and that it also motivates you to do further independent studies. If you ever have any questions, feel free to contact me. I love to talk about this stuff. But all right. God bless. Have a happy Halloween. Tomorrow, go trick-or-treating. Go to a trick-or-trunk. All right, bye-bye. Hey, before you go, I hope you enjoyed today's enlightening discussion during our Christian Apologetics book study. It's always a blessing to come together to explore our faith and grow in our understanding. Your participation means the world to me, and I'm grateful for your continued support of Northeast Christian Apologetics. Remember, you can stay connected with me and access valuable resources by visiting my website at nechristianapologetics.com. There you'll find a wealth of articles, videos, and recommended reading material to deepen your knowledge of Christian apologetics. If you're as passionate as I am about equipping believers to defend their faith and engage in meaningful conversations, you can also support this ministry in various ways. One way to support this work is through patreon.com. By becoming a patron, you'll have access to exclusive content, early access to our discussions, and a chance to connect with like-minded individuals who share your passion for Christian apologetics. If Patreon is not your style, some people prefer to give me a one-time tip. And if you'd like to do that, then feel free to do so through Venmo or Cash App. But of course, there are many ways to support me. By praying for this ministry, sharing the content on social media, or simply spreading the word about what I do. Every bit of support goes a long way in helping me fulfill my mission. Once again, thank you for joining me today. Your presence and engagement enrich these discussions, and together, we're on a journey to strengthen our faith and share the good news with others. Stay tuned for more exciting book studies, thought-provoking discussions, and opportunities to grow your Christian apologetics journey. I look forward to seeing you again.